Good evening, Sudeep.
Good evening. Lovely to see you, Indran.
Likewise, it's wonderful to have this chance to talk with you about Anthropocene and the art of poetry, which I know you practice and we both practice and been doing it for some time now. So hopefully we have some truths to share with our listeners and viewers. Sudeep Sen is a poet, a photographer, an editor, translator. He's a host, a poetry host. I do Poets and Writers Studio International with him once a month, and among other activities, and a ceaseless proselytizer for poetry and bringer of different poems and poets together. Right now he's in Delhi and has been there for some time, some years. And this book, Anthropocene, written literally from his house, from his library, and from the terrace outside, where I understand you walk and say hi to your neighbors and hi to the birds and to the sky and you photograph. So there are it's a fascinating sort of autobiography in a sense, at the same time as it is a call, of alarm or recognition of what's going on. Tell us a little bit about what was your thinking when you came up with this book, this title, which is, it's a long title, right? Go ahead and tell us the title.
Well, the main title is Anthropocene, but
Right.
There's a subtitle which is Climate Change, Contagion, and Consolation. All the 4 C's.
Right.
My own fascination with symmetry and asymmetry and tonality and atonality. But clearly the subtitle tells you about what the book is all about. I didn't plan to write this book, but we had a bad, as we know, in India, we've had a really bad couple of years with the pandemic.
Right.
Climate change is an issue which I've been following seriously for a long time. So it's not as though I thought of writing a book on it just because it's an issue that is current. But because of the lockdown, because suddenly all my travels, I travel 6 months of the year normally, to, certainly to Europe and sometimes even to the States for work. A lot of it is poetry related and teaching related, teaching creative writing and so on. All that stopped, and we were stuck in my house. And but of course, at one level, when I'm here in Delhi, this is what I do. I am mostly stuck in my house. I'm kind of not that social. Having said that, of course, when I meet friends, okay, in the evenings, I can be gregarious, but generally, most of the time, I'm by myself. I like my solitude. And it was, when people talk about quarantine and solitary existence, all that, as you probably know, are very familiar tropes and situations for writers, poets, and so on. So in that sense, that wasn't very a problem area because it was familiar. What was problematic was the interaction with other human beings and the fact that you can't travel. So what do? You write, and then of course it was such a tumultuous time that you cannot but not respond to what's happening.
Right.
And when you're constrained in terms of space, you find innovative ways to look at the world. So for instance, I have this window in front of me, and there's this gorgeous big neem tree which acts like a big curtain. It's a picture window, and I've always seen it, and I've occasionally written about it. But then when you're so intensely locked down, then you actually see at a micro level things that you tend to gloss over. And because one couldn't leave the home, terrace was the only place I could go to for my walks and to have some fresh air. And everybody, this is early stages of the lockdown, before the first wave, or during the first wave, very early stages of the lockdown, now almost 2 years ago. All the neighbors were also out, something that had stopped. In my childhood, of course, people were out much more than, now. You were out in the garden and the neighbors would walk by and, people would just pop in for tea. And, you would talk across the walls. It was very common.
Right.
So it was actually quite nice that happened because, you're talking across from the terraces and adjacent terraces and so on. So it sort of brought back a lot of memories. Also, I just tend to photograph things, and with mobile phone these days, it's always in your pocket. And suddenly, because of the lockdown, the pollution situation in Delhi improved vastly. So after a long time, one could see blue skies, the birds were back, and it was just a sort of a joyous moment. So as it turned out, I would take pictures every day, and I realized I'd been photographing the same spot. There was a tree and the sunrise, sunsets. For over a month, I photographed, and I had all these, about 50 photographs from the same exact point. Right. And I selected that as an illustration of how skyscapes transform themselves. Of course, it's very, very allied to the poetry I've written. So it was another side, a visual, not representation certainly, but it certainly acted as a contrapuntal image.
Yeah, that's a fascinating side to this book. I mean, that then suddenly you're turning the pages, and then you come to the sort of third or fourth section. There you have these images, these photographs, and accompanied by with images. I mean, two, 3-line poems, that accompany.
Yeah, so those 2-3 lines poems are basically extracts from the poems which are in the book.
Right.
In fact, some reviewers have mistakenly thought that those are poems on themselves. Separate, they can seem like sort of, non-haiku like haikus, but they aren't. They are actually just lines from various poems during the book, because I wanted to thread them together.
Right.
And the poems were not written for the photographs, and neither the photographs were taken for the poems. And of course, the book, as you rightly point out, it is multi-genre. So there's poetry, there's prose poetry, there's sort of meditations written in prose, there's photography. The aspect of design is very, very important in the book, because
I agree. And let's talk about design for a minute, because the architecture of this book fascinates me, and the fact that, in a sense, you're an architect and a poet at the same time, and a photographer. I mean, all of these things. So it's almost as if, when there's an old line about the sound and the sense, or if you have the rhythm or something, the words almost don't matter, they just fall into place. So I think you have the architecture, you create the architecture in your, every piece is a beautiful sort of design, and it's almost not that the words are irrelevant, but that they, when you have the house built finely, sketched and well constructed, then you're almost creating a sort of template for the reader to fill in as he or she wishes. So anyway,
it's I think you put it very beautifully. Well, I'm not an architect. I did study architecture. I was planning to be an architect, and what did I end up doing? Study literature and became a poet. Always take decisions which are not very practical. But yes, architecture is something that has interested me. I had 4 years of architectural and engineering drawing in school, so it's very much just more than just an interest. For instance, the house I live in, I design myself.
Okay.
Yeah,
and I know you make films as well, so I mean that's another kind of.
Well, Columbia, my final thesis at the Columbia J School was documentary films, and then I followed that on with a degree in filmmaking from the New School just after Columbia.
Okay.
So it was a very important, and the first, I don't know, maybe 6-7 years of my working life, I was making documentary films. So that's something that I've been closely associated with, and I would shoot the films myself. So the camera was a very important tool. I
Talking
always
about,
prefer,
sorry, talking about the camera as the eye, there's a kind of mechanical aspect to the camera as well, isn't there? I mean, it works a certain way all the time, but then there's a human aspect that shapes what the mechanical aspect is seeing, and that's where you come in with your poet's vision, I think, with each piece. But I mean, it's an art that you do that is very postmodern, very contemporary in that sense, because you assemble, you reassemble, you look at verses from other poets, the contemporary poets, poets who passed on. You cite them as epigraphs. You weave their lines into your own poems. You have a dialogue with them. I mean, there are poems where you dialogue with a poem by Fiona Sampson, for example, a poem by you honor, and this beautiful elegy, Driftwood, about Derek Walcott. There are poems dedicated to poets and writers like Amitav Ghosh and so on, Kwame Dawes. So tell us about, and why did you read 2 or 3 of the poems? So our listeners who may not know your work will hear a few, then we'll come back and talk about them.
Yeah, let me just answer the question before I read the poems.
Sure.
Because the mood that you create with the poem is very different, and so when you answer your question, it might sound very prosaic. Yes, so it is just, I read voraciously, poetry especially. I mean, I try and keep up with poetry as much as I can, especially poets who I admire, young poets who send me their work, friends over time who are writing. I try and keep up with it as much as possible. In India, it's a bit difficult because, it's very difficult to get hold of the books. But many of my friends, would just send me a copy, so, that's what we do. We swap books. Unfortunately, when I'm traveling, I can give an actual copy of the book to my friend. But here, from so far, PDFs have to do, unless there's an edition in the States, which, by the way, Anthropocene will also come out in the States in January as a US edition. So it'll be much more easily accessible. So while I'm reading all this, so poetry is one part, but also the visual landscape is very important. Because of photography, I sort of see things in aspect ratios of 4:3 or 16:9, or it's almost built into my kind of human eye aperture. Similarly, my ear is also very much in tune with music. Is something that I've always enjoyed very, very much. Often music is constantly on. Not cacophonous music when I'm writing, but certainly music is on. So the calibration of both spaces and the tonal quality of music contributes to the architectural part of the poetry. Dedications. Now, dedications are a curious thing. When I've written a poem, it's not necessarily always dedicated to someone, unless, of course, it's very specific. If I'm writing an elegy, or if it's a birthday, I want to gift it to someone, then it's a different thing. But when I finally, put a book together and I'm just revising it, sometimes I just feel like some parts of the poem reminds me of something or a book I've read, and I feel like just gifting a poem to a friend. So so when you see the dedications on top of some of the poems, they're not necessarily linked with that person at all. It's just a piece of art I've created, which I've gifted to that person. It's like taking a photograph or doing a painting and you come and buy the painting in my gallery, except that here it's just a gift. So therefore the dedication. It's also, as you rightly pointed out, it's honoring people who you've liked, disliked, or admired, and so on. Because many of these people are formidable people in their own right, whose work is very thought-provoking. And parts of their creative and intellectual enterprise seeps into your own space. So when you, as we say, when we are our age, it's nice to be generous because, one's lived through a young age and so on. So that's how the dedications happen. Sometimes it's a gift, sometimes it's an actual act of honoring. But let me read one of the poems you wanted me to read, which is called Disembodied. It's the second poem in the book. It's fairly self-explanatory, but it's very much located in the city I live in, which is New Delhi. And New Delhi, as you know, is terrible when it comes to pollution, especially in the winter months. And I'm an asthmatic patient, so it becomes almost unbearable. Partly it comes from there, but it's the whole idea about climate change is obviously embedded in this whole thing. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from Aurora Borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, new vinyl dub remix. Our universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worshipped, not for its blessing, but its contour, artificial shape, shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by season's first rains, skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no pole star navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away, just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there's too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass.
Bravo, Sudeep. What a fine poem. I mean, really a rich, I mean, we could spend hours just taking a look at each phrase there. And you dedicate the poem to Amitav Ghosh, of course, who is a great writer as well, and a writer on this subject, of.
Indeed, yeah.
And
so it was really the dedication, as I was telling you about dedication, this dedication happened much later after I'd written the book, and the Great Derangement made a big impact on me. And now, of course, volume 2 of Great Derangement, The Nutmeg's Curse, is coming out next month. So it was just kind of saying thank you for writing that book, and because this is so related to the kinds of issues he talks about in many of his novels, but that particular book, in that book in particular. But yes, it's dense. The poems are very dense. They're, the phrases are very, very condensed. So when a poem like that has phraseology which is so dense, then one of the ways I try, talking about architecture and placement on the page, is I've placed the poem in a kind of scattered way. It looks like a very fragmented poem.
Right.
Though when I read it, it's very lyrical and they form. I could just as well put it together in tercets if I want, but I purposely kind of spread it out over the page because part of it, the visual representation, is the fragmentation of the world itself and how things are sliding and glaciers are moving and the tectonic plates are moving and so on. So that was part of it. And the white spaces, just allow for these little islands of phrases to kind of float on their own, because they themselves are like atolls who are about to be drowned if the sea level rises.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of thought. Yes.
No, but I love that image of it's sad, it's horrifying to think of the islands being submerged, countries disappearing because as the sea levels rise. And yet the poem is being true and being to the beauty of what's going down the long slide, in a sense, and it's interesting what you say about that you could have written the poem in tercets, or you could have written the poem in a more sort of traditional way, I suppose. But of course, now the traditional is non-traditional in a sense. After Eliot's, free verse opening up the line and the page to the word experiment is sort of, it's funny to know what is experiment anymore in poetry. Because,
yes.
At the same time, I salute your playing with space and with. I just think it's and I as a poet would feel inspired to do more of that, or to do it again, or to go back to that.
See, the thing is about this kind of experimental poetry, or at least the layout, certainly, because this, as I said, could have been, I could make the lineations look more traditional.
Right.
The danger is if it doesn't work, it can be disastrous. So you have to be very, very careful about which ones. It's like implosion and explosion. I kind of took a traditional looking poem and exploded it and let it scatter. Now, if I go through the drafts, I think this poem was more regular. My first 10 drafts might have been much more regular, but I decided much later to have the layout like this. And then you'll see other poems in this book, which are very, very strict metered poems. There are cinquains, there's sonnet sequences, there are sestinas and so on. And, so there are lots of different kinds of that aspect as well.
Tell me, another thing that struck me reading the book was the poems that are descriptions of certain, for example, the heat or the clawing heat or the excessive heat of that you are experiencing, let's say, in Delhi at a particular time of the year, but then there's the stench of death and the heat of the sort of coming. I'm in my imagination from the funeral pyres, all the people being turning to ashes. But in terms of this heat, where does the poem? What's the final sort of purpose of the poem? Is it to create that image and then to let the reader take it and interpret it and move, or is it to infuse the image with some kind of teaching or some kind of a point that you want the reader to come away with and say, or an agenda? I know this may seem like a trick question, but I'm just curious to know, when you're writing a description of, maybe you could read one or two of those poems that I'm referring to, where you're talking about the heat, the micro poems, and it's what you're looking.
Yes.
And just.
But I'll answer your question, because I know where you're coming from. Yeah, it's
Right.
not a trick question. I don't think you're trying to trick me here on the program, but it's a provocative question, certainly. Now, it's a bit of both. I want to lay out a palette of images and let the reader decide where to take it. That's very important, part of keeping the poem open-ended, because you want the reader to engage and make something out of it beyond what you've done. So because I think good readers are much more intelligent than the writers themselves. Because they actually very good readers, they are the ones who lift the book to another space, because of course we do our bit and then they do their bit. I never have an agenda when I'm writing a poem. Poetry for me still happens in a very old-fashioned way. I'm suddenly inspired by a bolt of lightning and I scribble some phrases down. And at some later point when I'm revisiting my notes, the poem will form. Or I would write out the first draft very quickly and then revisit it, a few months later to see where it goes. So I never have an agenda, unless, of course, someone asks you to write a commissioned poem. For the longest time when I was a young poet, I used to really sneer at the idea of how can people write commissioned poems? That's just doesn't sit well. But I know, when you get more skilled, it is possible to do, if someone now tells me, okay, write on this particular topic and within so many lines and within a particular metrical framework, I can do it because we're just more seasoned. It's like, say, to give you an example of a cricket, Sri Lanka and India, both great cricketing nations. And you think of, say, a former cricketer from India, a captain, Azharuddin, who had just the most beautiful leg glance in the whole world. Now, when you see him leg glancing, say, Thompson or Lilly, so effortlessly, you feel, gosh, this is magical. It's poetic. It's like balletic. But why does he do it that way? Because there's hours of practice in the nets and experience. That's what makes it like so easy, because it's not the easiest thing to do. So the same thing with form. Once you actually master it, and we can't master anything in one lifetime, but certainly become adept at it, then working around those things are much easier. Certainly, I definitely feel, again, in a traditional way, that it is good as a young poet to write formal verse, because then when you're breaking the forms, then you know what you're doing.
Right.
If your palette is only free verse and experimental verse, it'll be very difficult for you to do the other side. Not that it's important, but it's important to kind of have the tools to play with, which is why no two books of mine are ever the same. Critics of my poetry, especially academics, serious academic critics, have found it really problematic. How do we pin this guy? My book, Distracted Geographies, an Archipelago of Intent, was entirely based in Scotland. So here's an Indian who's writing about Scotland as a native Scottish person. And that particular book also is very interesting in terms of architecture, because it's a long, thin poem. And it's one poem, it's a long poem, and it takes place over 206 pages. Why 206 pages? Because the architecture of the poem is inspired by the human spinal cord. Also, at the same time, I was very, very immersed in reading Neruda and Paz's elegies, which were shaped similarly. If you take like this country they come from, it comes from Chile. And if you take a photography of Chile, in fact, a black and white photography of Chile, it looks like a human spinal cord. So the two things were married together. Why 206 pages? Because there are 206 bones in the human body. There are 33 chapters because there are 33 vertebrae. So there was all kinds of biological, geographical mappings that came in, and it was just fun. It's completely unimportant for that poem, for a reader. But if you like that poem and if you want to revisit it again, there are all these other little caves and cavelets or tributaries.
That's great. I must get hold of that, or you must get that to me, because I'd like to.
That's available in America very easily. The Wings Press, I think, did the American edition. So it's just, that's in Texas. They did the American edition.
Going back to let's hear a few more poems, because I want to be sure that some of the variety is heard. For example, I.E., which is a lovely poem, and It's going to be a song, I understand as
It
well.
is a song, actually.
Yes,
In
and-
fact, you can play it. It's on YouTube.
Okay.
Is it
Oh, you
possible to
can
play
already.
it live? It's already there on YouTube.
Uh,
Is it possible to play it?
well, I
we
mean,
are-
if you have it at hand, you can to hit the tape. Why don't you read it, and
I'll just read the
we
poem.
we can have
yeah.
the song later. Yeah, go ahead.
So that is the title is I.E. And it's a very sparse poem. And then it's dedicated to my son Arya. And when Arya first read it, he says, Baba, I don't really understand what it is, but it's very beautiful, even though I don't understand it. And that's part, sometimes just the point, the visceral quality of aesthetics, the beauty itself. And then your mind can travel into lots of spaces. And you can interpret this poem in so many different ways. The obvious one is, of course, climate change. But just enjoy it for what it is. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves.
Lovely. The sea, silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. You can rest and have a drink and be content. Having produced that line and having produced it for your son.
Yes.
Obviously, one son.
Well, again, the dedication came much later.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
Yeah.
It's and tell me about Derek Walcott. Now, Derek Walcott, among the various poets you've met and in your life and you've read, I know is very special to you and to me and to many. So read. Why don't you read the poem if you don't mind?
Yeah, let me read the poem first.
And talk about the section of the book in which it's coming from, because you organize the book in under different subheads, and I think that's interesting for the listeners to know why that poem is there.
So this is in section 6 called Holocene or Geographies. Now, some poems like this it can fit into various sections where, because there are sections like obviously pandemic, global warming, climate change, contagion, and one can fit, as you know, a poem in any of them. But what happens is if you put it in that section, then the reader will predominantly read it through that lens. But I wanted some of the poems to be much more open-ended. So I put it under geographies. And geographies can be anything, whether it's cerebral or actually earthly. So that's the section it's in. And it's called Driftwood. And it was inspired by, I was in his house. I was staying in his house. And the room I was staying in had a little balcony, and there was the banister railing, which was kind of weather beaten, and some of it was broken and falling off. And, I would sit there in the early morning, have my tea, read and write. Few days later, I saw part of the banister missing. It was swallowed by the sea at some point, I'm sure. Or maybe I just imagine it because it's just an interesting story. That was what prompted me to write the poem. And then, of course, I dedicated the poem for Derek's 85th birthday. So there was a gift later on.
In what year did you write the poem? Do you remember? Was
85, when he was 85. So it must have been a while ago. Yeah. So Driftwood for Derek Walcott and Sigrid Nama. And it opens with Walcott's line from Archipelagos from the book Map of the New World. And I quote, "At the end of the sentence, rain will begin." I mean, look at the audacity of this. The poet just writes, when the sentence ends, the gods will open up and it'll rain. So as a young poet, I said, man, I mean, this is the kind of power and confidence you have. But then, of course, when you grow older, you realize, there's so much more to it. And I quote that as the last line. It's in italics, of course. So when you see the poem, it's clearly attributed to Walcott. Driftwood. At the end of the sentence, the rain will begin. Part of the banister railing is absent in spite of its strong metal rivet moorings. Termite eaten, consumed by the sea, I can see its woody skeleton float far away among the surf, its salt-scarred coat tossing and struggling to keep afloat against the waves' incessant lashing. There is music in its disappearance, a buoyant symphony, note strokes resurrecting life, a new story, history restored by resilient fingers of a master artist. Wheelchair and weak legs are inconsequential impediments, his mind sparking with electric edge, whiplash wit at its most acerbic. There is generosity for family, friends, those who are gone and remain, and 30 new poems and intricate magic of ekphrastic love. In the garden, in the front garden, facing the same sea with Pigeon Island on the horizon's left, lies a cluster of wind-eroded oval rocks. Their shapes mimic a lost egret's nest or a ballerina's curved arch, a stone memorial for a close friend. The driftwood is now out of sight, part of his house donated to the sea. In gratitude, the sea sings a raucous song. Folded cumulonimbus clouds echo in synchronicity, a soundscape absorbing his commandment. At the end of the sentence, rain will begin.
Oh, magnificent. The part of the house donated to the sea. I mean, I'm brought as a poet and as a traveler as well to other seascapes poets and their homes by the sea. I mean, I'm thinking of Isla Negra, Pablo Neruda's one of his homes,
Yes.
which was fundamental to his work and to many of the things he saw from his window and walking by the sea. I'm thinking of on your terrace, Derek, painting, looking out at the sea. The sea is so important to his work and to Neruda's. But you're in Delhi, in a city, you're not near the sea, but yet, of course, feel free to be a poet of the sea as well. I mean, you are a universal poet. I mean, there's no, you don't. I'm living in the moment in Rockville, quite at some distance from the sea, but the sea is fairly present anyway in all of our lives on the planet. I mean, the ocean, it should really be called ocean, the planet, really, given the amount of water and compared to land.
But sea for me was never part of my literary landscape. It never is. It never was. And so even now, when I'm in a seaside, I love it for a while, but because I'm not native to a seaside, I get bored very easily because to me, the sea doesn't change that much, or, I'm not a kind of person who sunbathes. So it's hot. I'm usually under the umbrella with clothes on, maybe having a cold drink and reading, the other friends swimming and getting blanched and bronzed, not exactly my idea of happiness. So I'm much more of a mountain person. I love the mountains. I've written a lot on mountainscapes. But, when you spend time in a situation like this, when you're in someone's house and so much of it is sea inspired and sea driven and sea soaked, and the smell of that kind of sea, the saltiness and so on, is ever present. And the kind of, I could see the way the house is constantly eroding. Painting the house was a big expenditure, I'm told, in many of these countries, because they just have to protect it from the weather. So yeah, I mean, when you're a poet, you just drop them in any landscape and that's fertile, it doesn't matter really. The sea to me then becomes a churning cosmos, it's like the mother's womb in a micro way and the churning cosmos in a kind of a macro way. So it's this fluid space where you can inhabit, and then when you look at it closely, then you start seeing layers, much more so than I would have otherwise if I had spent time near the sea.
Does Sigrid continue to live in the house there?
She does, yeah, she does, yeah. It's a stunning house, with a view of the Pigeon Island across the bay, and there's an infinity pool in front. So, and there are lots of references to various things because it was a gift poem for his birthday. So when I talk about the egret, one of his book is called The Last Egret. Then the stone memorial for a close friend. So when Seamus Heaney was a very close friend of Derek Walcott. So when he died, I mean, he was very, very struck and very sad for a long time. And he told me that those stones under that palm tree, those bunch of stones, that's my memorial for Seamus. So that's the reference to that. It's not important, but these little things which are so meaningful to him, I thought it'll be nice to kind of incorporate.
Oh, now it's shared with whoever watches this conversation, listens to this conversation. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Seamus Heaney is a great poet, and their friendship, along with Joseph Brodsky, is
it's quite friendship. That I mean, can you imagine? I mean, we don't have poets of that caliber at all anymore. Probably I'm making a sweeping statement, but just the three of them gathering, all Nobel laureates eventually.
Right. I mean, that's right.
And Brodsky, of course, was again, an early influence in my life. I mean, New York City, I met him there many times. And I was living in the village, as you know, and he was just around the corner on Morton Street. So I visited Brodsky in his studio flat, and he read some of my early poems, and so that's another chapter and story altogether.
And I didn't know about your those meetings.
No, I never talked about it because when you're a younger poet and when you're in your sort of mid-30s and 40s, I never used to mention these things because people then can take it in the wrong way that you're dropping names. But now I'm not saying one is that old, but
now the names are being dropped because of the virus and so on.
Yes.
So we have to.
No, but these are very important part of my poetry landscape. So they astute reader picks it up in any case. Because I've seen critics picking these references up and they piece it together, which is lovely. So now it's a story which is nice to tell because these people are no more. You see, if they were living, I would never talk about these people ever. That was something that I just learned, it's not something that you do.
In the few minutes we have left, I think we should talk about Anthropocene, human made, and what I know. Auden's line that poetry makes nothing happen, and that many poets rail against that line, and many accept it and go on with their day to day. Where do you see Anthropocene in the climate debates, in the political debates, in the literary debates, and where are you going next in your what are the projects you're working on now that you can share with us?
So Anthropocene was an accidental book, but having been an accidental book, it happened to be a very timely book. So, the publishing situation is really, really grim because most of the publishers have cut down their list by 70%, certainly in the last 2 years. So one feels very grateful that the book actually came out in this time. A lot of it is to do with the timeliness of the topic, I'm sure. But, it was also something that I was very passionate about. But the most important part of the book, there are various important parts of the book because it's structured, in a particular way. But the last section is about hope, about light. And that is really the message of the book, that, come what may, we will still live on. It's only the human beings who suffer from this kind of angst. The bird outside the tree comes and pecks every day. The leaves come out when they have to come out. The sun rises every day happily, unhappily. They don't have these angst about anything. The world actually will carry on regardless of our angst. And that's very important to remember. And in fact, I bookend the last quotation in the book is from this great Polish poet, Czesław Miłosz. And I'll read this 3 lines because that's really how I want to end the book, the tonality of the book. And he says, and I quote, "My generation was lost, cities too, and nations. But all that a little later. Meanwhile, in the window, a swallow."
Lovely, Milos.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Beautiful, yeah.
So yes, so this book has taken very interesting turns because normally, a book like this is discussed in the literary circles. It's in the books pages of the newspapers, and it's a more literature-oriented kind of audiences would ordinarily read my work. I'm not saying others don't, but that would be a safe space, I would assume.
Right.
But even before the book was launched and when the PDF review PDFs were being sent out, I got contacted by the Norwegian Climate Agency and their writers union. They wanted to do an interview because they said nobody, certainly poetry, nobody's done a sustained book on climate change and global warming. And can we talk to you? So that to me was very thrilling that, scientists got in touch with me, and that too in a non-native, non-English speaking country, and they were interested in this. I was told by the editor of The Week magazine, which you're familiar with, which comes out from the south of India, that we are planning to send the book to the science reporter or editor, not a literature person, for it to be reviewed. To me, that is thrilling because it's actually going beyond the literary boundaries. And to me, that's important because, poetry should also carry forward in a serious way beyond the poetry circles. Because
I fully agree with you.
Because it can be a ghetto. And, a lot of my collaborations in poetry, as I collaborate with musicians and artists, and because I'm a photographer and so on, there's that interface. My next book, you were asking me what am I doing next, is a book called The Whispering Anklet. It's all about classical Indian dance and Western dance, and classical dance has been a big obsession of mine for the last 35 years, and I've been writing on it. Some of the poems have appeared in the various books I've published thus far. But this book is going to be all my dance poems. And there's a friend of mine called Aditi Mangaldas, and she's this absolutely stunning Kathak dancer, one of the best in the world, I think, especially because when she pushes the traditional Kathak into modern dance, and it's very, very contemporary. So initially I thought, I'll have photographs of dancers, and the Bharatanatyam will have some Bharatanatyam dancers, Mohiniyattam, Kathak. And then it became problematic because I didn't want the book to be cataloged because it's a book of poetry, actually. The photographs are tertiary. So then I decided that, I want photographs, but very abstract photographs, like, just the corner of the eyelid or the nail or the toe ring or the swish of the garment. So very beautiful and abstract. So I asked Aditi, do you mind modeling? So Aditi said, of course I'll be delighted to, but, all my senior dancers will go crazy because this is, who is this? Why is she being highlighted? I said, listen, don't worry. It's my decision. It's ultimately my book of poetry. And we have a very dear common friend, Dinesh Khanna, who's one of India's top photographers. So Dinesh shot Aditi for the book, and the photographs are gorgeous. Gorgeous. It's very, very ethereal.
Oh, you must let me see those
Yeah,
photographs.
when the book comes out, I think it's going to be the most exquisitely beautiful book. Unfortunately, a normal publisher, I don't know whether they'll be able to publish it. It's going to be very expensive. It's a 4-color coffee table type, ideally,
right.
because it's just very lush and all that. So that's what I'm working on. I mean, the poems are written, the photographs have been taken. Now it's has to go out to the designing stage. And when
Wonderful. Well, we're excited.
Together,
I can speak for the collective we outside of the
no,
poetry
and the
world
good thing
as well.
is, the good thing is, I intensely spend so much time with the photographer and a dancer. No poetry at all, because I was seeing the poetry in his photography and the poetry in her dance, and they see the same in mine.
Wonderful.
So, and the wonderful thing is, of course, it's all when we chat about it, we say that, when you have a dance performance, we can do some poetry readings and the books can sell there. When I have literary events, you come on stage and talk about this. When he has photography exhibition, then we can be part of it. Ideally speaking, of course, the pandemic came and everything. This book was supposed to come out before Anthropocene.
I see.
But it just got shelved because, the designer who's going to work on it, just wasn't available. So at some point, hopefully next year, this book will come out.
Wonderful.
So that's what I'm working on. And then, of course, there are so many other projects. I'm editing 2 big anthologies. One is the Best Asian Poetry of 2020-21. The Best Asian Poetry very much is inspired by the Best American Poetry series. So Kitab publishers in Singapore already has a very fine list of Best Asian short stories and Best Asian science fictions. So this year they commissioned me to do the poetry volume, just launching the poetry volume, the poetry section this year, poetry book this year. So of course, it was an exciting project to get Asian poets in first time again in one volume, because initially, of course, you think about English language writers because, we write in English and so on. But then I realized, my God, there's Japanese and Korean, there's Farsi, there's Ukrainian, there's, Filipino writers.
Exciting. I'm looking forward.
It's really, really exciting. Really, really exciting. So that's one book. And the other book it's 15th August. It was just 75 years of India's independence. So I've been commissioned to do a big anthology of modern Indian poetry in English, spanning the 75 years. So it's manic at the moment. That's what I'm doing, apart from so many other things one does.
Oh my God.
But it's nice to just be with poetry, and it's nice to just, these are lovely moments when we just steal ourselves from daily life and just focus on poetry, and is a beautiful bubble, I think.
We've gone over our time, but that's fine. But why don't we finish with a poem? And the outlaws will be the last words of this particular emission. Thank you so much, Sudeep Sen, for sharing this time with us. We're old friends, and it's good to be back talking about your new book. Go ahead.
Indeed. So let me end with a poem which you wanted me to read. And this was written during the height of the pandemic, during the lockdown. And it's obviously a take on, it's called Love in the Time of Corona. And the way this happened too was very strange. The Indian Express newspaper editor asked me to write a op-ed piece. But little did he expect that I'm going to send him a poem, because that newspaper doesn't publish poetry.
Right.
But I sent him the poem, and very gallantly and very brave of him, he actually printed the poem. And when he printed the poem, it became viral because, newspaper, Sunday newspaper, very rarely do you get it. So a lot of people read it, and it got translated into at least 20, 25 languages all over the world because it was timely and so on. But anyway, that's the backstory of this. It has 2 epigraphs. The first one from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, of course, from Love in the Time of Cholera. And he says, I quote, "I don't believe in God, but I'm afraid of him." And the second quote is from Bertolt Brecht. And it's again a famous one. In the dark times, there will also be singing. Sorry, in the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. Faint indigo tints in the grays of your hair evoke memory. Krishna's love for Radha, its perennial longevity, its sustained mythology, its blue-bathed lore. Such are life's enduring parallels. 14 years, yet my heart flutters, infatuated like first love. My hands fidgety, palms sweaty, pulse too fast to pick. I'm not allowed to touch your face. Cyber flurry emoji love cannot assuage fears or corona's comatose cries. I don't believe in God. In thousands, migrant workers march home. Hungry footsteps on empty highways accentuate irony. Social distancing, a privilege only powerful can afford. Cretins spray bleach on unprotected poor, clap, bang plates, ring bells, blow conches, light fires to rid the voodoo. Karuna's karma infected. Mood swings in sanitized quarantine, self-isolation imposed, uncontained virus, viral. When shall we sing our dreams' epiphanies? City weather fluctuates promiscuously, mapping temperatures by polar graph. Tropics air conditioner chill, winter's unseasonal hailstorm, skies pink blue spring.
John Wall Barger or John Wall.
Blue gray will mold into salt and pepper, ash gray to silver white, then to aged white. My lungs heave, slow grating metallic crackles struggle to escape the filigreed windpipes. I persist in my prayers. I'm afraid of him. Hope, heed, heal, our song in present tense. Thank you. It's a good one to end because that's the book is about that, hope.
Yes.
Heal.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sudeep. And thank you for this time.
Thank you, Indran. It's a real delight to do this. It's a different kind of engagement. So I really enjoyed it. I know we could have gone on, but
yeah,
I'm glad we spoke.
Thank you. Have a good evening, and we'll be talking again, I know, very soon. All the best to you, my friend.
Adios.
Okay.
Bravo.